For so much of the Ukraine war, the focus has been placed on Russia's tank losses and its reliance on Soviet-era metal that is being torn apart by Ukraine. But Russia's stockpile issues go so much deeper than that. Beyond the tanks, Russia is running out of something else that is vital to its war effort. Something powerful, irreplaceable. The one thing that has allowed Russia to carry out its brutal aerial campaign against Ukraine is going the way of the dodo. Russia is running out of bombers, and it can't replace those that are being destroyed. There's a deep crisis in Russia's aviation sector, and it spells disaster for Putin's plans for 2027. And right now, there is nothing that demonstrates Russia's problems better than what is happening with its Tu-22 bombers. On June 16th, Euromaidan Press revealed that Russia started its war with Ukraine with a stockpile of 41 Tu-22M3 bombers. Now, it may only have 9 left, as the bombers have either been taken out by Ukraine or experienced malfunctions far behind the lines, often inside Russia itself. United 24 Media backs this report, noting a Tu-22M3 crash that occurred in the Irkutsk region of Russia in June is the third to have happened in as many years, as 2024 and 25 saw similar incidents, both at the same Belaya airbase that is in the region. Now, the outlet claims as much as 70% of Russia's entire Tu-22 fleet has been lost. That's a problem, for 2 reasons. First, there's what the Tu-22 is supposed to bring to the table and what the loss of so many of them means for Russia. The Airframe was the first supersonic bomber to enter production in the Soviet Union, and some variants of the Tu-22 have been in service with the Soviet military since the 60s. We won't pretend it's the most impressive bomber in the world. It isn't. But its combination of supersonic speeds and its ability to launch several varieties of cruise missiles, along with glide bombs, make it an asset to a Russian military that is trying to weaken Ukraine using constant airstrikes. Every Tu-22 that goes down is an airframe that can't be used to pelt Ukraine with missiles and bombs, and that is an issue that Putin doesn't want to face. But the far bigger problem is this: Russia hasn't made any new Tu-22s since 1993. Russia has been losing Tu-22s by the bucket load, and absolutely none of them are being replaced. Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb destroyed 12 alone back in June 2025, striking against bombers that were located at the Belaya, Olenia, and Diaghilevo bases. Since the beginning of the war, at least 24 Tu-22s have been destroyed or damaged, and all that Russia has in place is a modernization program designed for the declining stockpiles of Tu-22s that it still has in its arsenal. There are no spare parts. Even minor damage to one of these bombers can result in it being completely written off, as Russia doesn't have what it needs to make repairs. That means that every Tu-22 that goes down is a bomber that Russia will never be able to replace. And the worst of it is that this failure to replace the bombers it loses doesn't just affect one model. It's a systemic production failure problem that extends to the entire Russian aerospace industry, both military and commercial. Let's head back in time to January 2026. In that month, something interesting happened at the Tupolev aircraft design and manufacturing company that was responsible for building the Tu-22, along with several of Russia's other bombers. Chief executive Alexander Bobryshev made the surprising decision to step down, or more likely was pushed out, and was replaced by a man named Yuri Ambrasimov, who previously served as deputy managing director for economics and finance. The leadership change was particularly notable because it came soon after a previous wave of purges in 2024, and it means that the company that manufactures and repairs the Tu-22M3, Tu-160, and Tu-95MS is now under new management. Why should you care? If you know anything about Russia, changes at the top of businesses don't tend to happen unless there's something so catastrophic going on behind the scenes that it can't be hidden by bribes and backhanders. And that's precisely what's happening at Tupolev. Bobryshev left under a cloud of legal claims filed against his company by Russia's Ministry of Defense, practically all of which were filed as a result of Tupolev failing to fulfill contracts. Lawsuits were filed and the company paid out millions, but that did nothing to change the reality. Production targets were being missed across the board in both the military and civilian aviation arms of the business. Defense Express revealed some interesting numbers. It pointed out that Russia's defense ministry received almost $53.5 million in combined settlements from Tupolev. That number is interesting because it's roughly the same as the cost to modernize a Tu-95MS bomber, and it's about a quarter of the amount that Russia spends to build a Tu-160M. In other words, not a whole lot. And if that's all that Russia's defense ministry claimed, it reveals plenty about the state of Russian bomber manufacturing. The company that is supposed to be refurbishing Russia's aging fleet couldn't even push one Tu-95MS out of its doors. Looking beyond that, the company was also supposed to produce 4 Tu-160Ms for the ministry, all of which were to be built between 2022 and 23 and delivered in 25. But only 2 ever reached the Russian military, and both arrived in 2026, which is a year after the initial deadline. Late deliveries are one thing, but to be late and only fulfill half of a major order is a sign that something has been going very wrong at Russia's premier bomber manufacturer. And we can even throw a few Tu-22M3 issues back into the mix. Tupolev has been overseeing the modernization program for that aging Soviet bomber. When that program started, Tupolev claimed that it would modernize up to 30 bombers for the Russian military. How many has it managed? 2. One in 2018 and another in 2023. Of course, 30 is a pretty ambitious target now that Russia is down to as few as 9 Tu-22s. But to only deliver 2 modernized bombers in 5 years is a ridiculously slow turnaround time. At that rate, it would have taken 75 years to get the whole batch done. By that point, even a modernized Tu-22 would be so far behind modern military aircraft that the bomber will be pointless. The leadership change is supposed to fix all of these problems. But the reality is that these problems can't be solved. Tupolev wasn't missing deadlines and under-delivering because its people were lazy or the company was mismanaged so badly that it couldn't deliver on basic contracts. What this entire Tupolev saga shows us is that the company is simply incapable of fulfilling orders because it doesn't have what it needs to do so. This is the same problem that makes every Tu-22 that Russia loses irreplaceable. Russia simply can't build more. And this is a problem that isn't going to get any better. There are a couple of reasons why Russia's aerospace industry is in the state it's in. We've touched on the Soviet-era airframes, and we'll be digging deeper into why that's such a problem in a moment. But there's also the cost factor to consider. Modernizing a single Tu-95MS costs Russia more than $45 million, Pravda reported in May 2025. A single Tu-160, which is the closest bomber Russia has to the formidable US-made B-52 Stratofortress, costs around $500 million to build, which is about 5 times as much as the B-52. These are hefty price tags when Russia is dealing with a war that has already cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And when those bombers come with the caveat that they can't be replaced, and often can't even be repaired, if they're stuck or experience technical issues, then you naturally get a Russian defense ministry that is hesitant about spending on a bomber fleet that is in desperate need of an overhaul. But all of this just brings us back to the bigger problems that Russia faces with its bombers right now: ancient airframes and an inability to get its hands on what it needs to build or repair. But before we dig deeper into both of those issues, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you like what you see from our channel, then make sure that you hit subscribe today. So the Soviet airframe problem. It's an absolute killer for Russia's bomber fleet. We brought up tanks in the introduction to this video, and a lot has been said about how Russia not only relies on Soviet-era armor for its ground operation in Ukraine, but is quickly running out of its Soviet-era stockpiles. One of the biggest problems Russia faces on this front is that it's being forced to burn through multiple old tanks just to get one up and running again. Euromaidan Press reported on this issue in April, noting that Russia was running out of T-72Bs that it could refurbish, which had led to it cannibalizing older T-72As just to get some metal on the battlefield. At the time, Russia had between 800 and 900 T-72As, though only around 500 could be possible candidates for refurbishment. The rest would have to be stripped for parts to be used in that refurbishment, and Russia would likely have been far short of what it needed to get all 500 possible refurbs functioning. Now take that problem and transplant it into a bomber fleet for which there are only a few dozen airframes available, rather than hundreds. Cannibalization still has to happen, but Russia runs out of the parts it needs much faster, and as with its tanks, it doesn't have the facilities needed to build more. These are, by and large, Soviet-era bombers, and Russia has long shut down many of the plants that made the parts used to build these airframes decades ago. National Security Journal also highlights this issue, noting that Russia had a bomber fleet of about 120 across its stockpiles of Tu-22s, 95s and 160s when Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. Even back then, about a third of the fleet was out of commission for repairs or modernization. Still, it was believed to be a large enough bomber fleet to handle Ukraine. It wasn't. And that's the problem, as the only one of these three bombers that is still in production is the Tu-160, and as we saw from Tupolev's problems, those airframes aren't being built anywhere near fast enough to make up for the bomber losses that Russia is experiencing. Since production resumed on the Tu-160 in 2019, only 6 have been delivered to the Russian armed forces. Russia lost twice that many bombers to Operation Spiderweb alone, and it's lost many more besides. As for the other two, production on the Soviet-era Tu-22s and 95s ended in 1993, when the Russian Federation decided it was better to keep the money being spent rather than invest it in more bombers in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. In 2026, Russia desperately needs those factories back up and running, but that's impossible at this point. So much of the infrastructure used to make these older bombers was dismantled in the 90s, and much of the expertise needed to build them has either gone to the grave with those who held it or is inaccessible for other reasons. These are the reasons why every bomber loss Russia sustains is irreplaceable. And to really rub salt into the wound, this is a problem that we see across all of Russia's military. The Soviet-era systems on which Putin has relied so heavily in the war against Ukraine are one and done. Geopolitical Monitor says that in the air, Su-25 close support aircraft are no longer produced, meaning that the airframe has the same problems as Russia's bomber fleet. The T-80 tank family also can't be replaced, which means every new T-80 we see on the battlefield is really just another refurb that Russia managed to create by stripping away parts from other T-80s. Russia's A-50 airborne early warning and control aircraft is also under the same umbrella. TLDR, if it was made during the Soviet era, Russia no longer has the tools or know-how to replace it. This is what happens when a military fails to modernize at the level it needs while combining that failure with a refusal to invest in maintenance of the older systems on which it relies. Eventually, the stockpiles start to run low. Coming back to Russia's bombers, here's why so many of these airframes being irreplaceable matters. For much of the war, Russia hasn't been using its bombers as you would expect. It learned early on that flying aircraft over Ukrainian territory was a recipe for disaster. By May 2022, Ukraine had destroyed 199 of Russia's aircraft, UKR-Inform reported at the time, and Putin's response to that was to pull fighter jets and bombers out of range of Ukraine's air defenses. The strategy since then has been simple. Send bombers and jets up into the air, have them launch cruise missiles and glide bombs, then bring them back down without having to enter Ukraine's territory. It's a strategy on which Russia has leaned for years and has been trying to ramp up in 2026. On June 1st, France 24 reported that Russia had launched 211 missiles at Ukraine in May, which was among the highest monthly totals since the beginning of the war. Euromaidan Press reveals that Russia is launching 180 to 250 glide bombs at Ukraine every single day, which requires the flying of 200 sorties per day, which in turn places enormous amounts of stress on pilots and their airframes. Now consider this rate of aerial attack when stacked up against Russia's bomber problem. Russia's bombers are used to launch cruise missiles and glide bombs. Every single time one of those bombers goes down, be it to a Ukrainian attack at a base or simple maintenance issues caused by flying far too many sorties, that's an attacking threat that is permanently grounded. Slowly but surely, Russia is running out of its irreplaceable Tu-22s and Tu-95s, and it isn't building the Tu-160 at anywhere near the rate needed to keep up with the pressure. When the bombers run out, the attacks stop. There's also the nuclear issue to consider. When Ukraine took out so many of Russia's bombers during Operation Spiderweb, one of the biggest topics of conversation in the aftermath was the impact the strike had on Russia's nuclear threat. The Tu-22 is capable of carrying nuclear weapons, as are the Tu-95 and the 160. If those airframes are either irreplaceable or being built at such a slow rate as to be almost irrelevant, you get an aerial nuclear threat that is rapidly diminishing. And as each Tu-22 goes down, so does its ability to launch nukes, never to be replaced. Given how much Russia loves to throw around its nuclear weight as an intimidation tactic, the real-time crumbling of a large part of its nuclear triad is a situation that actively weakens Russia on the global stage, not just in Ukraine. Russia's nuclear threat is losing muscle by the month, but the real problem for Putin is this: there is no road to recovery that can be followed while the Ukraine war continues. We've already covered the Soviet airframe problem and the litany of problems that come from Russia relying on older bombers that can't be repaired or replaced. But the wider issue is that Russian aircraft building is in the toilet all across the board. We see that in the missed deadlines and glacial production rate of the Tu-160. However, looking at Russia's commercial aviation sector reveals problems there too. In an August 2025 report, Reuters revealed that Russia was increasingly forced to rely on lengthy and expensive indirect import routes to source components needed to keep its fleet of 700 planes in the air, with its big problem being that most of those planes are made by Boeing and Airbus, neither of which are Russian companies. Sanctions are hitting Russia's aerospace industry hard. In January, the Moscow Times reported that one of Russia's solutions for the inevitable shortages this situation creates is going to be to send Russian airlines mothballed Soviet-era aircraft in 2026 and 27. That isn't a solution. It's a continuation of the problem that we're seeing in Russia's bomber fleet. Returning to military aircraft, not even Russia's modern airframes can escape the sanctions problems. In both the Su-34 and Su-35S, around 80% of the critical electrical components needed to make those jets usable are made in the West. Russia hasn't said how many Western parts are used to make the Tu-160, but we imagine there are at least some, given that Russia's modern fighter jets need them so badly. Sanctions are biting for these modern military airframes just as they are in the commercial sector, which forces a greater reliance on the Soviet-era bombers and airframes that Russia knows are irreplaceable. It's a catch-22 of epic proportions, and it could end up destroying Russia's air force. What it all comes down to is that Russia can't build planes anymore, whether that be its modern fighter jets or its Soviet-era bombers. The more that Russia relies on its aging airframes, the greater the chances of them being taken out of commission with no replacements, leading to fewer aerial assaults against Ukraine. But if Russia stops using its bombers, then you get the same result. It's win-win for Ukraine and no win for Russia. And until the war ends and sanctions are lifted, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for Russia's aircraft manufacturing. Russia's bomber stock is collapsing. It has dozens left of a fleet that once numbered over 100. And for Putin, you can chalk up yet another failure to anticipate what Russia needs to be the military power that he claims it to be. This isn't the Cold War era anymore. But Russia is still fighting like it is, and its bombers are paying the price. Meanwhile, Ukraine is using a modern and asymmetric approach to hit Russia from the skies. While Russia tries to figure out a solution to its bomber problem, new and more powerful Ukrainian drones are wreaking havoc on Russian logistics in the occupied territories. In just one overwhelming attack, Ukraine destroyed 50 Russian vehicles on a key bridge that links to occupied Crimea. Find out more about that strike and what it means in terms of Ukraine's Crimean strategy in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more reports covering what's really happening behind the scenes in Russia's military. And thank you for watching.